This morning we have the privilege to hear from Mark Branson, who is a professor at Fuller on leadership and also author of several books, including the one with Nick Warnes, who's the pastor of the church that we're in right now, that's coming out that some of you may have. It's called Starting Missional Churches. So I look forward to hearing from Mark. So give it up for him.
Well, we've spent half the morning on the 134, right? Trying to get here. Good to be with you. I do want to get just a brief check-in. I've done that with a couple of you, but it's just good to hear kind of what stage you're at in planting, and where and what network, maybe just be basics. Something that was going on even not officially at the time we were both working on the book as well as on these cohorts, was that I'm now actually part of a church planting team too. So just 2 months into a Free Methodist New Start in Altadena. So I'll be able to tell a little bit about our discernment process and how that all came about. So not something I plan to do. I think we're the oldest church planting team they know of. We're ages 50 to 65.
Wow.
And have lived and been in that area a long time. Ryan Bolger, Julie Bolger, both he's at Fuller, are part of the team. But others. So anyway.
Who's going to be the pastor?
Deborah Williams. Deborah and David. Again, we've all known each other for over a decade and some 30 years. So these friendships go back a long time. So yeah, I can fill you in on some of that.
Yeah.
So obviously a story that didn't get into the book because it wasn't a story yet. So maybe just briefly around on those quick questions. My assigned topic has to do with how do we treat people like subjects. I think you already know the basic. But I want to work with that on what are the historical issues that have pushed us a certain way and to start understanding that as a huge theological issue. Part of the convictions behind what got Nick and me to write the book was how many church planting strategies assume your neighbors are objects. And most of the training in the U.S. goes that way. Most of the church planting strategies treat neighbors as objects. And what we found out was how hard that is to understand because of the water we swim in. The water we swim in is such that we are all made commodities by a consumer culture and by a modern culture that simply understands people are commodities. And so I want to push into that a bit, and I'm going to start just by having you talk to maybe not your partner, but somebody else at the table, so you may have shot across the table or whatever, but just get a partner and talk about a time somewhat recent where you were treated like an object, and think about both in the world, but also think about in the church. And I'm going to give you about 3 minutes, because this shouldn't be hard. So,
When you treated like an object.
When you were treated like an object. And listen, because you're going to have to tell me what your partner said. And I'm going to have you tell me what your friend said, rather than what you said. And so let's see how the listening's working. Why don't we start at the end of the table and we'll just come down the table.
Yeah, John Reed, I think, had a great example. He talked about car sales, how salesperson would approach and try to be nice, And once the car is sold, there's no interest anymore. So it's the end of the relationship.
So kind of a not totally fake, but the relational demeanor is all for the purpose of treating you like an object.
Yes.
Right.
So kind of this faux friendship,
Yeah.
but then it's done because you're just a commodity.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
He kind of shared the same example, so we just talked about that a little bit.
Okay. How about church-wise? Did either of you have a church illustration?
We didn't have anything specific. We just talked about kind of like the get people saved mentality and how that's been strong, especially like in my past. It's trying to get people to make a decision for Jesus, and like the relational aspect is kind of stripped from that. Yeah.
Okay. Next. Notice I'm treating you like objects here.
Both had the same example too, because she is a server at a restaurant, and so you're commonly treated as though the point is just to do stuff and not talk to us, and just get stuff here, and I'm happy. So.
Okay. You're a conveyor belt, just to get it out there. Okay.
Conveyor belt with a smile. That's it.
Okay. Did either of you have a church illustration?
We actually didn't.
No, we just
said
kind of
it was
talked
the
about
world.
that.
Yeah.
Now I'm seeing a pattern here. You're going to get a new assignment in a minute. Okay,
Like
next.
all my work trips.
Yeah, there may be extras on this end.
So with John, he was just sharing about being a white male. Sometimes people will automatically assume he's like every other white male instead of getting to know him and getting to see how, you know, maybe he's a little different than the majority. So.
Chris actually had several examples of what it had to do with going to church, like being objectified as they've been visiting churches, see different models, and like, so she's like the newcomer there, and so just being objectified as a new person, and how they treat you.
From the culture, and part of objectification is where you're not known as a person. It's simply you're one of a type, and the people that rather than learning, listening, simply proceed to treat you as a type. So you're a person who wants food, you're a person who wants a car, you're a person who's got some money, you're a woman with a guy who's planning a church. All of these are types, and so you don't need to listen if you know the type, right? Okay, let's keep going.
So Joanna didn't get a chance to share.
Okay, so here we've got a type. Talker, listener,
So I'll let Joanna go first.
James shared about being part of a church plan, a church start, but feeling very much kind of like a cog in a wheel, like there were tasks that had to get done, and he was there to fulfill a purpose and not necessarily be in like deep relationship. And then kind of a similar experience at another church where he was treated very kindly, but the relationships never went very deep, and it felt more like I'm just here to kind of fill this role, and I felt like fill this role.
Okay. Okay. So roles are another one. Again, all of these can be, we couldn't exist if we didn't have some capacity to deal with stereotypes. We couldn't exist if we don't have some understanding of roles. So you notice that all of these are kind of necessary for societies to function. But then at what point does it mean you're not a person? So, do you want to speak for yourself?
Yeah.
We'd be glad to listen.
I can, yeah. I think one that came to mind was just people, I think, in churches being closed off to musicians. And my husband and I, over the years of being at Fuller, felt this call to pursue a more holistic kind of healing for people. We should approach the whole church about that, and just like no interest whatsoever. I know, just to even get to know what that vision looks like, or get to know us, or we're a part of that. It's just like, nope, not interested. Go away. You know?
Okay. Okay. Good, thanks.
So Matt shared about being an instructor at boot camp, and it was a small business, so he was hoping to be seen as kind of a partner in the business, but he felt like he was being seen as just someone who could come in and do the work and leave.
Okay.
And they weren't interested in hearing more.
Just a cog in the business plan. Okay, good.
And Becca talked about some of the work they've been doing in churches with their sanctuary project, and specifically one group where, whenever she shared, the ideas that she shared, the comments that she shared, kind of fell on deaf ears, and that with a group of men specifically, and just as a woman, just that that feeling of being unheard, and I think unvalued in the way that that the expertise that she brings and the experience that she brings, and that in that circumstances they were kind of listening to James and and kind of what he had to say, even if it was the exact same thing she had said 2 minutes earlier.
Notice recurring gender theme here?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Did you get cut out of the...
Your worst secret ever.
Stories of when you were treated like an object in the world and the church. Shouldn't be hard.
It's not. It's trying to determine.
Sorting it out.
Yeah, I worked for a campus ministry for a while, and yeah, there were lots of moments and sort of caught in a machine, I guess. As a female, that would be probably a theme that ran throughout. But then also just like we're trying to keep this thing moving, and you're just a part of that. So good
Yep.
job.
Yeah. So a number of frameworks that you've provided, and I want to see if you can name them. We named one earlier, but I just want to have you see where this comes from. So we talked early on about the financial issues. If you just are a person with money and you want a car, you're inside a commodified capitalist consumer marketing system, right? And that pervades, that's the water we swim in. We simply are in a society where that dominates. What other frameworks then did you hear? That are societal frameworks that we're supposed to just be parts of?
Gender.
Okay, gender was another one, and that, even as it shifts, it doesn't shift. I mean, it's just painfully slow, even among those of us that know better, I guess I have to say. So,
I was thinking about like simplicity, like if it's simple, if it fits the mold, then it's easier to, like, we don't want complex stories, we don't want, I don't know how to catch that, but that sense of like, it's easier not to have to know someone. It's easier to not to have to be pushed in that way. So that kind of like speed or whatever, that sense of like, of impatience to, yeah.
okay, let me just test something. Modernity pushes functional rationality, and so I'm wondering if your simplicity is just that functionalism of modernity, that we basically look for how do we separate complex things into parts. This is the scientific revolution, right? So once you fragment everything, then everything's just known functionally. And again, that is how we do, that's how you do strategic planning, that's how we manage churches, that's how we manage a lot of our friendships, relationships. And so that fragmentation and how that then fits into strategic planning, the business arrangement we were talking about. That if you've got a plan and you've got strategies, you've got steps, you've got pieces, you've got consequences, you've got cause effect, and you're just one part of that. And that objectifies every fragment. And then when we do that in human relationships, human organizations, everything's an object.
Would you say like pragmatism sort of falls into that?
It can, yeah. The complexity around pragmatism is it took a split in late modernity, and one went more personalism and one didn't, and so it's a much more complicated. But in its popular understanding of just get the job done, people are things.
I was going to say, I hear two themes, which are control, and ownership, or like using, so like using somebody else for something you need to subjectify. So like want to sell a car, and then control, want to like run an organization, even run it well. And so the temptation, like the fear of not being able to control or not knowing how to deal with problems. So
okay, so the issues, predict, manage, control are all purposes of modernity. It isn't that they weren't there before, but now it's all lined up. Modern management theory of modernity is based upon those principles. That if in fact it works with the mechanics of the scientific revolution, it can work with human beings in a social organization. So around the turn of the last century, modern management theory was all developed out. And that's what, especially starting in the 50s, I mean, you see it starting to influence denominational systems in the 30s, and you see it in spades in congregational life from the 50s on. That once churches adopted modern management theory, then everything is kind of in and out, cause effect, butts equal bucks, programs attract people, all of those are all part of modern management theory. Does anybody, I mean, does all of that make sense? Now again, I'm trying to talk somewhat neutrally about just descriptive of the environment in which we work. Where you're all left as people who care about gospel on the ground is how are you going to relate to the realities on the ground? How much of that are you going to buy into? So let's talk just briefly. Now I want to do something else. I want to get into a text. I want to read, some of you probably already done some work with Luke 10 where Jesus sends the 70, especially if you've been in a class of mine. but even with this in the background then about what are humans and how do we relate to humans as people of the gospel, this text is one of the more provocative. I'm going to assume you've had some experience with Lexio. Do you know what that word means? Does anybody want the 3-minute explanation, or shall I keep moving? Okay. So I just want a couple of you to read it aloud, and then I'll give you just maybe 2 minutes to read it silently again. And just in that way, we're just inviting the Spirit to read the text. What's the Spirit want to provoke us with? So be aware if the Spirit prompts you to pay attention to something. It's also realizing whenever we come to the text, we come to the text with ourselves. It's always action reflection, that the actions we've been doing, your actions in your studies and in your work, you bring that to the text. So you can't avoid that. So all you can do is do that well. Do that conscious of when you're doing that, and when it interferes with your reading or when it helps you with your reading. So could I have a male and female voice to read this aloud?
I can read.
Okay, then I need. Thank you.
Can we just read half of it or the whole thing?
No, read the whole thing.
Okay. After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him, in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. He said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go on your way. See, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whatever you say, or whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace to this house.' And if anyone is there who shares in peace, your peace will rest on that person. But if not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Do not move about from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you. Cure the sick who are there, and say to them, 'The kingdom of God has come near to you.' But whenever you enter a town and they do not welcome you, go out into its streets and say, 'Even the dust of your town that clings to our feet, we wipe off in protest against you.' Yet know this, the kingdom of God has come near. I tell you, on that day it will be more tolerable for Sodom than for that town."
After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. He said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go on your way. See, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace to this house.' And if anyone is there who shares in peace, your peace will rest on that person. But if not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Do not move about from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you. Cure the sick who are there, and say to them, 'The kingdom of God has come near to you.' But whenever you enter a town and they do not welcome you, go out into its streets and say, 'Even the dust of your town that clings to our feet, we wipe off in protest against you.' Yet know this, the kingdom of God has come near. I tell you, on that day, it will be more tolerable for Sodom than for that town.
So repeat it again silently, just being aware of how the Spirit prompts you, or even if there's just something you're curious about.
But he drove away in front of us.
So again, you'll be reporting on your friend. Anybody need to check in now that they've forgotten?
Already did that.
Okay, we started this in this time, so just briefly report on what you heard, what your friend heard.
Sure. So Matt was looking at the second line where it says, set them on ahead at every place where he himself intended to go. And he was just wondering if that was like where Jesus actually was planning on going. Is it more metaphorical, as in like God, was planning to expand? Jesus intended to go there, but maybe didn't have time, and how that connects in with like the not enough workers.
And Becca brought up the repeat of the kingdom of God has come near, both as a statement for those that welcome, those that are sent, and then those that don't. So no matter what the kind of response is, that the kingdom of God has come near, it seems to be kind of this refrain from Jesus to the 70.
Okay, thanks.
James shared about towards the end where it talks about wiping off the dust in protest against those who didn't welcome them, and just like concerns with kind of that picture and like what Christians have done kind of in the past to people saying like, I don't have anything to do with you for whatever reason, and just like, worried in how you could take that, I guess.
And she thought it was like, she kind of looked at the same passage and related it back to, if anyone shares your peace will rest in the house, but if not, it will return to you. And thought of it in the sense of like, when you wipe off the dust of your feet, since your lambs among wolves, you're kind of wiping off the stuff that's bad that's attacking you. I guess. Part of that peace returning to the process.
You all do know that just before this, when they hadn't been welcomed in a certain city, what the disciples' strategy was, when they hadn't been welcomed, this was where James and John wanted to flame them. Okay, so you need to read this as trying to temper the hotness. We don't destroy when there's no hospitality. We just move on. So just be aware of the context of that particular. He's putting him in check. Okay.
So like John, what stood out to John was verse 1, just about being sent on ahead of him in pairs to every town. I think John was saying that like we're all put in places of whether it's our job or whatever. Like God wants us to be there, and He wants us to be His representatives in those places, so that they can come to know God through that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Chris was just looking at the harvest verse where it says, "Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out the laborers into His harvest." So kind of focus on the idea that as church planners, we're just part of it. It's really like we're not here to reap the harvest for God, but God is like raising a harvest to come along with us to do the work of the Lord. And so just the emphasis on those people that will work with us, work alongside of us to do the work that God's called us to do.
I was actually with Jane, and she mentioned the issue of the peace that someone brings, and yet the person who is welcoming someone actually shares that same peace, and so there's kind of this interesting reality that although there's differences between them, there's this common bond of peace that they've welcomed in this other person. So.
And Morgan shared about the 70 being sent, but then they were also dependent on the invitation of the people that were in the town. So this idea of like initiating, they're the ones who initiate, but then they're still dependent on the hospitality of the people that are present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting picture, isn't it? Okay.
John talked about they had to go into the town and stay at the same place, one house, and not moving around. So he thought that was thoughts provoking. That the Lord wanted them to stay at the same place in the town and not move around.
Yeah. Okay.
His was a little bit scatterbrained, but I think the big one was that even though these people are being sent, it doesn't mean that everything's going to go well. Like there's still that place for rejection that could possibly happen. Being sent, even though like rejection is a possibility.
Yeah. When we work with this passage, I was just talking to a church in San Francisco that they've been doing just this process, taking about an hour a week in their kind of teenage through adult gathering. And they've been doing it for weeks, same passage, and then seeing how to live it out during the week and then coming back. And so what happens in the week affects what they see the next week in the text, and then that affects how they attempt to live into it after that. So probably some of you already know that when you're doing Lectio in the midst of an action reflection church, that there really are values in doing a passage 10, 20 times, just to see how the Spirit continues to open it up and change your lives through it. As you look back in this, and there's a number of things you've already mentioned, on this subject object, can you tell me in the passage where people are being treated like subjects? They're being treated as human beings with choice, with agency. If you bring all of your Christian anthropology to bear, that God's created us as subjects. God gives us choice. God doesn't coerce. And then that same, we're commended the same way, to love people, not coerce them, to treat them as human beings. So where are some ways, even of the things you've already mentioned, where do you see that distinction showing up?
He tells them not to move house to house.
Okay, where does that fit this question?
Well, it's like they're not just, I feel like it's not like just don't go to house to house to house just to use their food and time.
Okay.
And like kind of just make, okay, we've done this house, now we go to the next one, make the next one a project. That's what it makes me think of.
No, I think you're exactly right. That the household could have just been a source of a bed and food, and delivering the religious goods and services you've got, and then moving on to the next, and intentionally breaking it. Somebody else, what do you see here?
Peace is like if anyone is there who shares in the peace. So there's a sense of like it's not, is there anyone who receives your peace or accepts even your peace, but I like that shares in the peace. So it's a reciprocal. And then it talks about their peace coming back, but I like that. The if statement, so it's not everybody, and then that sense of that peace being shared.
Okay, so you're really having to pay attention to a person as a person, aren't you? And this reciprocity, mutuality of it. So again, how do you get to know this person? And this social exchange is one way, but there's other clues, how long you hang out, those kind of things, that you're treating them as people. Something else?
I think it's interesting. It says eat what is set before you, and so like you don't have the menu set up for these people to make you food, but you actually you eat their enculturated food,
okay.
And accept that for what it is, and that's I think that's interesting.
Okay, so again, they're subjects, they're agents. They are in fact the hosts. You're the guest, which is a huge shift for often what's called this kind of neighborhood evangelism. They really are your host. Yeah.
It's interesting. I was going to mention the same point as John, but that said twice. Eat and drink what they provide, and eat what is set before you. Just in 12 verses, it's repeated. That
In case you forgot.
Yeah, in case you forgot. You go and eat what's set
That's
before
right.
them, and they are the host. I thought that was really.
It could be a kosher issue with them, but in any case, how do we enter into our neighborhoods as guests at their tables, rather than the ones with the food, with the pantry. We're the ones dishing out the food. We're in charge of it. It's our choice. It's our selection. You're our guest. This just reverses that whole role.
Yeah, like the power dynamic is upside down.
That's exactly right. So
Yeah.
this is one of the things at the center of the subject-object question, is the power dynamic. What's the difference when you're in the control, treating the other like an object, or when in fact you're mutual subjects in the relationship when you're together? And the power dynamic is hugely different, again, if you're the host on your turf in your event with your provisions, or when you're the guest at the table of the neighbor. Does that make sense? This is just a huge, and this is one of the things Nick and I really wanted to lean into in the book, because most church planning training trains you to treat your neighbors as objects. So, what else is in here? This is good, y'all are.
Well, kind of going along with that is, I mean, they're totally helpless. It says no purse, no bag, no money, no anything. You gotta go totally rely on people's hospitality.
So he's cutting off their possibilities, isn't he, of treating anybody wrongly. That you really aren't provisioned in the way you're used to being provisioned. This is not your strategic plan with all your necessary supplies. You're out there vulnerable. Something else? Y'all are good. Any other object-subjects distinctions you're seeing?
I'm interested in the greet no one on the road.
Yeah, that's a strange one, isn't it?
Yeah.
So much for friendship evangelism. Now, you do need to remember the next story is the Good Samaritan, where you are supposed to pay attention on the road. So Luke is not wanting you just to kind of totally miss what life is like on the road if God's up to something. But I don't want that to undercut this one. What could have happened to you on the road between towns? What goes on? Why would he not want you greeted?
Getting robbed. Getting robbed.
Possibly, but the question that's raised around that option is, are robbers going to wait for you to greet them to rob them?
Yeah.
That's true.
So it kind of doesn't matter on that one, does it?
This may be taking it too far, but there's a sense in which, like, when you greet someone on the road, you kind of lose that sense for them to be hospitable towards you, to show you the hospitality. You're kind of just a reciprocal relationship of maybe kind of goods or whatever that you're doing. And when you go into this town, you're in a different place, because you don't have what other people have. You don't have the money, you don't have the food, you don't have the housing, and so you have brought yourself to a place below in the town that may be harder on the road.
Okay. Yeah, let me raise just two cultural possibilities, and these, I go back and forth on this. One is the possibility of military people. These roads are general roads, they're guarded by, empires always do the same thing. They extend their borders, they pillage, they keep pulling resources from every place they can, and they use military means to guard those resources, those roads. So, how do they keep the trade routes open? And that was a major issue in Palestine. So how the empire had already commodified a lot of farming and fishing in Palestine as a way to feed their troops as they kept pushing east. And so we already know there were soldiers on the roads. Jesus another time says carry their backpack. So this is one of the dynamics. And if you greet, has anybody been in a nation where there's a military occupation or a militarized government? Any of you experienced that? Any rules about how you relate to the?
You don't.
Yeah, there you go. You avoid eye contact. So Jesus has given you a task. Just don't worry about the empire if you can avoid it right now. So that's one possibility. Because you would end up carrying, you'd have to do the other thing you said, and that's carry the backpack. Different gospel. The more likely issue is in this probably southern Galilee, northern Samaria area where all these texts are taking place. If you run into your third or fourth or fifth cousin, what happens next?
They invite you over.
And it's more than a cup of coffee. You know, it's Aunt Mary wants to see you, and you're down for days. I mean, that's just, so the cultural, think about the cultural obligations in a fairly tight-knit community where 3, 4, 5 cousins out, you've got obligations. And it changes days. And so there may be a way here, there's other places where Jesus is interrupting culture, like on the food. There may be a way here that he's saying that the culture can get in your way of the gospel. That cultural social obligations can prevent you from living out the gospel. And I think we all know that. There's elements of all of our cultures that in fact do stymie us at times. That would have been a very likely normal experience when you're going town to town, especially if you're a little ways away from home and you're closer to Aunt Mary's. Well, so both of those may be going on. The other thing that makes that there's a lot of other issues here we could get into, and I'd invite you to keep working with the text. Someone mentioned that the fields were ready for harvest, which minimally says God's an agent ahead of you, right? And if God's agency is the primary agency that you're responding to, if that's our work as gospel people, is we're attending to what God's already initiated, and we're entering into the initiations that God has going on in a location, in a geography. And this is saying it's God's well ahead of us. There is plenty of harvest, and there's questions about whether you are harvesters, but even if you are harvesters, you're creating new harvesters in each place you stop. And that means all of these are subjects that God's already created, and people as subjects are ready to join in this kingdom that also gets repeated. The kingdom's near, it is going on around you. And so that also says that God's work of treating people as subjects has already created a harvest, and you're in the midst of that in one role or another. The other questions would just come into a longer discussion around what actually happens when you're in the town. Once you're at the table, once you're receiving their food, what's the next day like when you get up the next morning? And just think about what it means to enter a household. It's very unlikely they're feeding you to be a preacher. That's not what they would be doing. But if you're itinerant, are you an itinerant laborer? Are you, even if you're just a guest, when a guest enters a household, you enter the activities of the household, which means the next morning you're not on the front porch swing while they go to the garden or the shop or to the field. You're with them, which means they're subjects, you're in conversation, the same cool of the day when you gather, and you're subjects, they're subjects, and you're continuing to carry out this mission God has you with real people rather than others. So briefly, when you think about church planting, what are some ways to treat people like objects? Maybe that you've seen or experienced yourself.
You assign them tasks, but you don't know them.
Okay, so you give people work to do without knowing.
I just saw advertisement for church plant starting in Fulton, and right off the bat they were asking for donations.
Okay. So we need your money to do our thing, carry out our strategy.
Worry about numbers more than anything else.
Okay. Commodifying counting. How about how you relate to your neighbors, people you don't yet know?
There's an agenda.
Okay. And this is a hard one.
Yeah.
Jesus wants all to be saved, he says. So what's the difference between having a telos and having what I think you mean a manipulative agenda? And that's the question you're always going to have to live in. We do care about the telos of the place, of the earth, of creation, of the neighbor. And yet we don't want to manipulate an agenda and treat them like an object.
guess if the telos is reconciliation to God and each other, then sharing to them the good news about how that reconciliation can really happen is a natural part of it. But it's not an agenda. The agenda is love. So you definitely have an agenda. But the agenda is love and relationship and not objectification of I'm trying to get you to commit to this or say this prayer or join this church. But, right, so the agenda is being in a loving relationship with those with whom you love and shalom. And part of that function is the stuff that God does to enable that to happen. And so I think that helps me to sort it out. I don't know if I named everything. At least in my brain.
Yeah, that sounds like some good kind of sorting we need to do. And by the way, this is going to be constant action reflection for you. And just be asking the Spirit to teach you when you're treating people as objects.
I think with neighbors, like, you can be tempted to kind of go where the best chance of success is, rather than where you're called to be, or who needs to be loved.
Okay.
You need to share love with. So, like, you know, it's very much like when you're starting a church, there's a lot of nervousness and fear about this thing working because it's financial and like, what are we gonna do? You know, there's all this stuff that comes out, and so it's like, well, where we're the most guaranteed to get members, or so.
Right. Yeah, there's a whole lot of ways to commodify the location, the people, the process, into the strategic planning where you know I've got to accomplish this. And once you have that kind of calculus going on, then we very quickly do move toward how do we nudge this, make this happen, rather than allow people to be people. And again, we all want not only people to be saved, we want them to be sanctified, we want them to be using their gifts, we want them to become generous, all of those things that God's on about in people's lives and our lives, God's still on about. And it in fact it's the way we push it into strategies and manage it and predict it, control it, that objectifies. And this is why when you read the New Testament, it is so messy. It's messy because that's the world that God's created and that God's living into and inviting us to live into. But it really does defy control.
I was thinking about, like, just as a way of objectifying is forgetting that we are a part of a long story, you know, that they're, just with our own faith and the faith of Israel, but just even like in the neighborhoods, you know, remembering there's people that have lived there for 30 years, 60 years, longer, and that there were people there before them, and just, I think, that sense of like, I see with sometimes church plants, like, day one, and it's like first public worship meeting, you know, and in a sense of like that nothing existed before that. And so I think just being reminded of the longer story and being willing to push back into that, and how the community is shaped by that. So.
Yeah, longer story in the community, longer story of God in the neighborhood, longer story of churches in the neighborhood. And especially those of us that are working in cross-cultural environments, whichever way, it's just incredibly important to have mentors who are not your ethnicity. So if you're in a diverse environment and you want your church to express that diversity, make sure you're hanging out and placing your life into relationship with people of the other culture, especially if you're doing church, meet the other pastors and be mentored by them.
And I think as well the longer story going forward, I think that sense of like, if we're talking about a telos, being patient for that telos in the sense of that, not just that, you know, the work we're doing in the next 6 months and that work we're doing in the next 5 years, but what would work look like 200 years from now in this community, and how do we affect that? But it's hard to think about that.
Even think generation out. Are you working for the 10-year-olds? Are you creating a civic environment, are you living into the eschatology of here's what the new creation would look like for 10-year-olds in this environment? Because hopefully your impact will last 10 years, and by then they're young adults. And you have, what you do makes a difference for today's 10 years. So be aware of just the constant temptation to be those who deliver good services, truth, because you've got it, they don't have it, you're supposed to get it to it, right? That's the constant temptation. Church, new church, old church. And so instead, what's God up to here? Who are these neighbors? How can we be guests at the table of the neighbors? How do we get to know them? One of the things Nick and I talked a lot about was how some of the training he had basically was under the framework of figure out the gifts in your church and the needs in the neighborhood, and then match those, and how objectifying that was. And God taught them that early on. God started helping them see, there were also gifts in the neighborhood. And once they linked gifts with gifts into what God was doing, especially initially at the school, but then some other ways, they started finding the relationships they wanted. But as long as they kept it, we're superior, we've got the goods, you're the needy, it just was screwing up all those relationships. And again, that's a very common way for church plant training to take place. So this stuff is incredibly subtle, and we've all been, and again, I try to avoid blame because we've all been shaped by this. The whole idea of vocation is you become the specialist, you become the expert, so you can give your stuff to somebody else. And church planning, in as much as it follows that, it's not just a strategy problem, it's a theological problem. It's not treating humans as God's created humans. And it's not allowing salvation to work in the way that God's created salvation to work. So it's a huge theological issue. We go till 10:30, right? I can give you 3 minutes on my church. We're new, that's about right. The story's a little bit longer just because we've all been at the same church for quite a while. And over a period of years, and this was historically an Asian American church, that it was increasingly diverse. And Nina, my wife, is Chinese American. We're good friends with a white Japanese couple. David and Deborah are African American. And these are just good friendships, and the Bulgers both white. And other friends that we've had there. And over a period of time, we had increasingly been connected with the neighborhood in a way the church had disconnected from the time that it first started, when it was an ethnic neighborhood. And so it was up to where the church was about half of its original ethnicity and about half other. And a number of years ago, just a couple of blocks from the church, a young African-American man was shot leaving a party and killed. And Brandon was somebody most of us didn't know, but as his about third-generation gang family, he wasn't in the gang. He was a Christian kid who was captain of football team, honors program with a local high school, and just somebody everybody loved. His twin brother was in the gang, and parents were already dead. An aunt was there, older sister, but no church connections at all. And Brandon's sister knew enough to know that he needed a church funeral. That's kind of all she knew. And started checking at churches, and either because it was across the Bloods Crips line, which is not a safe thing to do on some of these, or just some just had a fear of doing a shooting that may have been gang related because of the family. They went to David Williams, our friend, who had coached the neighborhood basketball team and had coached Brandon, and knew he was a Christian. Says, "Can you help us find a place to do a funeral?" And so David came to the board of our church. Amazingly, a few years earlier, the board probably wouldn't have said, "Yeah, okay," but they said, "Okay, we'll do this." And 400 people were at that funeral. It was just huge. Both the sheriff and the police were there. We're right on the Pasadena city line into Altadena. And he said this is the largest hierarchy of gangs they'd had in one place in a while. And in the testimonies, there's an open mic for a while, and long line of both teachers and neighborhood people and other kids. And it was just phenomenal storytelling about Brandon. And a lot of them had the Jesus part. Not all of them knew that was part of it, but a lot of them did. And it just was it was just really amazing storytelling. And Brandon had talked about stepping into the light, and that phrase kept being repeated. Deborah, at the end of that, invited anybody who wanted to understand what Brandon was talking about, of stepping into the light. She put pencils and paper in the pews. She said, give us your Facebook, we'll friend you, we'll talk. 86 kids handed David and her husband their Facebook connection as they left the funeral. And so over the next week, she just friended them all. We had a dinner, invited them, invited their parents, and about 40 came just on pretty short notice. And again, just an amazing story, night of stories. An Azusa Pacific professor, a friend of ours, Chinese-American woman who grew up in the gangs in San Francisco, the Chinese gangs in Chinatown, told her story. And this wasn't quite the person who expected the gang stories from. But it was just an amazing evening of fearful parents, of kids saying they didn't want to get in the gang, but there was pressure and all of that. And we connected with the local gang intervention groups and some weekly studies. Anyway, that's just continued to connected them with other churches because most of them were African American, Latino, and those were the smaller, those weren't as much part of our church. But increasingly, they and family members would show up. And in the next year or two, our church went through a pastor change. And other shifts to where, while the neighborhood had been more connected with the church, these neighbors were finding out they weren't welcome. It was pretty clear that they weren't going to be welcome. And it just became awfully painful for all of us that they picked that up pretty easily. And so over a period of the next couple of years, the four of us, and for one reason or another, just left, basically over those reasons. We just can't be at a church where the people we know, and we'd all been 15 years into the neighborhoods by then, aren't welcome. And so so it's that group that then came to, we knew we were just going to have to hold each other accountable to not just drifting, but to what God, we still were doing neighborhood stuff. We'd started a basketball tournament to honor Brandon. That's been an annual thing. We're up to the fourth one now. And all of Pasadena, Altadena high schools and middle schools participate. It's the only thing like that. And we've been raising about $15,000 a year for neighborhood scholarships. Almost all of them, their first kids from their families to go to college. And then connecting with their parents. It's just been absolutely amazing because we live in those streets. These are the people we know and we can connect with. And so we knew we had to stay on mission. The question was, what's the church structure for staying on mission? And that became, as we just started getting together about once a month and praying, continuing to share stories about what was going on in our neighborhoods, these relationships. And just kept feeling prodded to plant a church. I mean, we really tried to duck this, honestly. And talked with I've got a number of very good pastor friends nearby, and they're very much helping us on that discernment because they've been a part. We've lured them into a lot of these relationships too. And so starting in the fall more intently, we've been just specifically asking, do you want us to do this? If so, what network? We don't want to do this alone. Same question some of you are facing. And so we would spend a long 2.5 hours of just reflection on scripture, storytelling from the week, and placing this before God. And then a lot of silence. This group can easily sit for 20, 30 minutes in silence and speak out of the silence. That's just part of the discipline. But as I said, a pretty multicultural group. So Deborah, who had been the pastor of youth and families at this other church, was the person who we thought would be, well, we were sure would be the person who, if there was a planter among us, it was Deborah. And so PCUSA actually, because this was a Presbyterian church, welcomed her into their training and then spent another day with us, even though we said we're not likely to be reformed. Because even though all of us have been in that church, that's just theologically not where we're at home. And so, but they were just, Craig Williams was just terrific at every step of the way. And then we spent long evenings or half days, ECC, Free Methodist, Nazarene, Vineyard, Stadia, and I'm leaving somebody out. And just praying with, discerning, and all these systems really did serve us well. They just were terrific at good questions, talking about us as a team. We went through all the core clarity stuff that PCSA offers. And eventually went Free Methodist. And part of that was theological. Part of it was how absolutely amazingly encouraging they were, and just ready to, they just said, we just think God's calling you to do this, and we just don't think you ought to be waiting a lot longer. Finish your discernment. We'll pray for it. We're for you, whether you go with us or not. But they, as a denomination, I don't know if any of you know, they were formed later part of the 1800s, pulling out of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the national event, both over free pews, which was jarring in a lot of churches back then, if you know history of the country, free slaves, and within 10 years they also were ordaining women. So that was all part of their differentiation from the denominations of the 1860s, 1870s. And since we wanted Deborah, African-American woman, as a church planter, this was making more sense. And we knew we had the finances among us because we hadn't been tithing in 9 months by then. We'd all been stockpiling money. And we had enough money to guarantee Deborah a year salary at what she'd been making. And then the denomination actually said, we can help you out with more to just get started. So we hadn't expected that. But all we've done is we're not starting with a weekly worship. We've said we don't know what worship should look like till we're a circle or two out. And so we're planning maybe a monthly worship. On Pentecost, we baptized 5 of those young adults and kids. One guy we've been tracking with who just got out of prison after 3 years. Just his life is a different place. So just a phenomenal first worship service. And so we'll worship about once a month and are just intentionally not creating those as neat scripted events. But we want to know much more about who God's calling before we know how to do that. But the rest of it is we knew if we simply announced that Deborah was preaching the next week, we'd have 70 people in the room. And they would all come with all of their expectations of what they didn't get out of their last church. And we just are really cautious about that. And also because Ryan and I are both professors at Fuller, we're well aware that we could just get an influx of Fuller students, which are really good people. But we don't want that to be the type that the neighbors see immediately, although we do really want to welcome and enter into training and internships with students. But that we think we need to be another step or two before that. And so as people express interest, what we're doing is we're saying, can I come over? And 1 or 2 of us go and sit on their porch, walk around their block, and pray with them about their neighborhood. And this is church. So we're starting church now. We're starting it here as we walk the neighborhood and pray for your neighbors. Which ones do you know? What are their names? What do you know about them? And letting them and just asking them what God's up to there with these neighbors, so they're aware of ways that God's serving beauty, reconciliation, truth, justice there. So that they know that's church, that it's church in mission and in worship as we start doing that. So those are the ways we're starting. We don't have any plan beyond that, and it's just that fragile, but we're aware of what we're not wanting to control us, and we're aware that we're already 10 years in the mission in these neighborhoods and want to honor what God's been doing in those relationships. So that's where we are. It is very tentative and very experimental. Any questions, notes? I know we're at the end time.
When you guys are building relationships with new neighbors, I mean, even according to this, like, people are inviting you, I mean, so do you guys choose not to host before being hosted? Or, I mean, are you guys trying to do things like that? And if so, how are you even instigating? You know, like, I mean, do you even offer, like, hey, I'd love to be over at your home someday? Or is it more you're not even trying to say, like, even that to you is initiating too much? Or
No, we're fine with that.
like, someday it'd be wonderful to spend time with you at your home, or like
Yeah,
that
do
isn't a
you have time for a cup of coffee? Can I come by?
Okay, yeah. So that might be a litmus test or a feeler or a, hey, is this person even wanting to host me? Or
Right. Now remember, I mean, you can be hosted, like in this passage, you can be hosted at the dinner table, you can be hosted at the town square. There's different ways to be hosted as long as you're aware you're the guest.
Right.
And that's the shift from old missionary of, I'm really in charge here, I'm just delivering what needs to be delivered. So how do you get, for this church, it was how do they become the guests at the local school? Start entering into the lives of the community in a grade school, in an elementary school. So where are the places that you can be hosted in community groups, arts groups, civic organizations, where it's their turf, not your turf, and you're there as a guest. So that's homes, parks. I get amazing stories up in Santa Barbara around a small group of people that are just 7, 8, 9 months now into hanging out in a local park, and what that's shaping up, and just in this kind of work, keeping conversation.
How do you balance the prophetic with the subject?
Keep talking. I think they fit, but I want you to know.
Yeah, well, I
It's a
think
very
just,
important question.
yeah, and I don't want it to be too theoretical, but I think just that sense of like, there is something about the gospel that rubs, and something about the message, and it's not a denial of that there's something up, and something is happening, that God is working, but there is also this sense that where like God is calling people to something different, and how as a church do we do that in a way that doesn't create the person who's, doesn't create that subject object, but that still pushes that sense of this world we live in is broken. The systems that we have in place are dangerous and are, murderous. And
yeah. I mean, obviously, since a lot of our connections are in and out of the gang world, we're but also we're in and out of the Walmart world. We're in and out of ecological disaster and issues of urban gardening, etc. One of the ways that we're taking that on. How do we create urban gardens and participate there? That's a great place to enter into as a guest if there's one, or join others to start one. If I understand right in this, once the other knows their subject, then the possibility of you really being a subject with a voice is also there, but you're there as a mutual subject instead of the arrogance comes up. And so there are all kinds of ways that in the town square, there's sickness here to be healed, and you're invited to enter into that. Notice even when the peace returns to you, what you're supposed to do in the passage. Did y'all notice that? When the peace returns to you, what's your next step? Stand out. So we're in relationships where it's not all easy. And I don't have to pretend that, let's say that was a person who's really working fine financially with the empire. My guess is there's people in your community who are just fine with the economic systems the way they are in this country. And they are so anti-God, there's just stunning. But how do you enter into the life of people who are just fine with the current arrangements of the empire? So I won't bring up Walmart always on the first conversation. That's just an issue in Altadena. One of the things that we've really benefited, yeah, but they're not doing well. This is, we're just celebrating the fact that it kind of was doing okay for a while and less and less. Anyway, so how do you raise questions with subject to subject? That's just what it means to be adults, and we're not good at that. And there's not a lot of models around. But we ought to be models of what it means to be adults in a civic environment. And yeah, there's both beauty to identify and corruption and life-numbing, life-denying forces. Can I pray for you as we close? I can hang out a little longer, not real long, but a little bit. Lord God, we're grateful that your Spirit, your Word, our friends, our imagination, all are ways that you create learning, conversation, hopes among us. So I pray for these men and women as they seek to discern next steps, as they live and imagine and pray their way into places. That you will be the one that shows them fields that are white, that will create tables of invitation. Show them appropriate use of voice and activities so that they as subjects, neighbors as subjects, that we all